Hello, everyone. So this lecture, we're going to go over and talk about research methods in social psychology. Talk about some of the common techniques that are specific to the field. So, as I mentioned in the previous introductory lecture, we know that social psychology is very experimental. They take the research seriously. They use a lot of statistical tools, and they get a lot of heat and a lot of controversy due to their problems in some of the research that they do. And a lot of that, in my opinion, probably has to do with the fact that they just do a lot of it. And so it's just one of those things. The more you do something, the more people will criticize, just because there's a lot of stuff out there. But some of the things that are just inherent in any psychological field are these fundamental issues. And one of them is, of course, measurement. How we measure a variable is very important. We have to be able to measure it precisely, just like the other fields, biology, chemistry, physics, measure their variables very, very precisely. So in social psychology, of course, having a very sound operational definition is very important. Just to clarify, operational definition just means how you define something, like having a concrete statement or definition of what self-esteem means, to put in very simple terms. So social psychology, of course, every so often you hear in the news, so and so research cannot be replicated, or so and so got in trouble for this type of research because there were it had some weird flaw or some weird findings. Like, for example, there was this recent research a couple of weeks ago that came out that showed, it might have been a couple of months ago, right? That showed that there's gender differences in how people interact with their mentor. If you have a mentor that matches your sex, let's say, for instance, might be beneficial as opposed to, let's say, a female student and a male mentor. And they got a lot of heat, right? They got a lot of back and forth. Social psychology is at it again with their inflated type of statements. But we have to be able to measure things correctly. We have to be able to have sound definitions. Without them, psychology just becomes a washed up field. And with those sound definitions, we also have to carry ourselves very ethically, right? We have to create studies that are ethical in nature, that are not meant to offend anybody in some sort of way or harm them any other way that you would experience harm in day-to-day life, like asking sensitive questions, for example. We have to carry things in an ethical manner. And another issue, of course, is weird samples. What does that mean? Well, many years ago, I had no idea what this meant. And now it's becoming kind of a common term in psychology. And what a weird sample means is any Western population. It's basically Western educated, industrialized, rich, developed countries. That's what weird stands for. And that basically means that a lot of the research in psychology in general focuses on the West, as opposed to hunter-gatherer societies, countries like Pakistan, countries like Southeast Asia. Everything's done in Europe and the United States, where there are dominant schools and fields. And that's a problem, because not everybody in the world, right, is going to behave like an American or like a European. So these are issues that we have to address. So there's different ways in which we conduct studies. The most common way, and the most probably one of the stronger methods, is a laboratory study where we do an experiment. And I don't want this lecture to be a runaround of research methods or a runaround of intro, but always keep in mind that an experiment is something in which you can manipulate a variable into different conditions. Very simple, right? One group gets randomly assigned the experimental / treatment condition. That could be a medication. That could be the way that you treat these people. And we have a control group that does not. Right? There, for simplistic terms, it's a comparison population. You want to compare it. And you want to be able to say that X causes Y. If I give you something as part of this treatment group, you're going to act in a different manner compared to the other group that got nothing, or something of minimal impact. And that is how we're able to determine causality, whether a variable is actually causing a change in another variable after we eliminate all other factors. And social psych does a lot of experiments, and we do a lot of experiments with, all topics that I discussed in the first lecture. Stereotypes, persuasion, attraction. The list goes on, right? In group versus out group, etc. But it's one of those things that is fundamental in psychology, and the social psychologists do it very, very well. But that's not the only way in which we gather information. We also do non-conscious research, and this is very, very controversial because it's that idea that people may not be in control of their thoughts or in control of their behavior. So if you look at the screen here, there's a lot of fill in the blanks. And if we do a task that measures how fast you respond to these things, are you really thinking hard about what you're doing? We have number one, if we were to do very fast, coffee, milk, toast, fruit, right? Or the last one, maybe the last one's not fruit, right? Fruit. I'm missing a letter, right? Maybe the last one is some other term, right? And in social psych, they use a lot of implicit association tasks, meaning that if you are given a word like black, right, and you're asked, okay, I want you to respond by pressing the right button to indicate that that's a positive word, or press the left button to indicate that's a negative word, and as fast as possible after many, many, many trials. Okay, you're given the word black, respond. You're given the word coffee, respond. Given the word child, respond. And if we do this over and over again, we can kind of get some sort of index of how you respond to these things and whether they are conscious or not. Do you actually respond negative to black or positive to black? These are non-conscious research, and they get a lot of heat for being, unrealistic. Do we really respond implicitly unconscious to others? And you've probably heard the term in the past couple of months, maybe years, of an implicit bias, right? Is there really implicit bias in the world, right? Am I really being an implicit racist, for example? Knowledge in these types of things help you criticize the findings that people find and report them in mainstream media and mainstream research. So that's just another method to consider. We also have archival research, which is becoming very, very popular, finding research in databases that we thought were private, but they're not really private, like Facebook, for instance. To give you a quick example, there's a well-known researcher from Australia, from New Zealand to be specific, and her name is Candice Blake. Look her up. She does phenomenal research, and she looks into archival research. And one of them is, can you actually locate, based off tweets, where liberals and conservatives are in the world? And that sounds kind of scary, right? And the whole point is, if there are certain types of individuals that are tweeting very prejudicial type of things, is it possible to predict whether a crime would happen in that particular area? Like example, let's say you find a lot of people from Laredo are tweeting that women are second class in comparison to men, and then you find out that Laredo has a high rate of domestic violence. Can you actually predict these things off of tweets, off of social media? And a lot of the archival research is she does is focused on that aspect. So that's just another method of collecting data. Now, of course, we just don't collect data and not do anything with it. We analyze it using statistics. Statistics is phenomenal. I teach statistics. I love statistics. If I could teach statistics for the rest of my life, I would do so. That's how much I like it. But statistics, of course, allows us to probe questions that are interesting, probe questions that are important, and allows us to make sound statistical conclusions. And of course, we follow these key paths. We plan a study, we examine the study by looking at the data, and we infer from the data what these things could possibly mean. Like, for instance, if women are scoring higher than men on an exam, on social psychology test 1, what does that mean? Does that mean that women are better than men? Or does that mean that women from this particular class just did better than men in that particular exam? So we draw conclusions. And we have to be very careful with the data. We have to be very careful with how we form conclusions because it's very easy to, fake the data. It's very easy to manipulate data. I can manipulate data and make it seem like it's the best thing ever. It's very easy to do. So we have to be very critical and know what these things actually mean. So for example, anytime you do research and you hear about significance, what does that mean? Um, let's say you do a study, right? And you're doing a study on infants, and you want to find out whether infants vary on a particular characteristics. Well, you also have to look at whether there are other variables, of course, of interest that that the researcher missed. One of the key things in doing sound research is you want to know everything about your population. So if you're doing a study with infants and you want to find out whether infants are different in a particular task, and a very common thing that you often hear about is comparing males and females on, let's say, how well they do in kindergarten or in first grade. Okay, think about that. Let's hypothetically let's plan a study. We look at males and females in a first grade class, right? Typical school. Sit them down. You want them to do something, and then you start noticing, okay, the males in the class are just very hyper. They're not doing their homework, not doing anything, right? Can you form conclusions and say that females just outperform males? Can you form conclusions and say that males are just too hyper, that they are different than females? If you don't control for the general characteristics that comprise a male or female or comprise an infant at that age, you're missing a lot of things. For instance, children are naturally hyper, right? They need to explore the environment. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way they are. Males in general typically a lot more hyperactive than females. If you know the research on ADHD, you'll know that males are overdiagnosed and more diagnosed than females on ADHD. And there's a lot of genetic components for that. So just by saying that females outperform males, and just by saying that males are more hyper than females and they're failing at this particular grade level is not enough. You have to control for everything. Okay. So one thing that you see in studies a lot that are reported, and I want people to understand this, is the level of significance. The p-value, what does that mean? And in psychology, we're obviously obsessed with the ambiguous number of 0.05. If anything is 0.05 or less than that on the p probability value, that means that, hey, I got something, right? There's a problem to that thinking. And one of them is that p-values tell us a little piece of the information. All a p-value means is basically the likelihood, right, that you would expect to see given results if the null hypothesis were true. And if you remember from stats or research methods, the null hypothesis, NULL, means that there is no difference. So an example, if your p-value is less than 0.05 and you are comparing males and females on a given task, after controlling for everything, if that p-value is less than 0.05, then that's telling you that yes, there is something here. Females are doing better than males, males are doing better than females. If the p-value is 0.06, do we completely ignore that there's a difference? No, right? We can probably further explore and investigate. But just by obsessing that the p-value is less than 0.05 does not necessarily mean that this will always be true. Because if you study a separate population, you may not find those same results. So it's important to understand what statistical significance means. I know this is not a stats class, but for the sake of understanding journal articles, every time you see that 0.05, anytime you see that something is significant, that's just letting you know that they are different, right? That the means, the averages are different between what they are particularly studying in that research article or in that paper or whatever you read in the book. Now, oftentimes in the news, you hear about p-hacking, right? Like hacking the computer, right? P-hacking generally means that oftentimes researchers, either intentionally or not, will fiddle with the variables just to get a p-value less than 0.05. That way they can publish it. It's p-hacking, right? And it's becoming a lot more common knowledge that people are a lot more aware of that, but it's one of those factors that it's unfortunate. It does happen a lot, but we have to kind of consider all these things when we do research. Now, another important thing, of course, is generalizability. How similar does the sample need to be to the population? Can you generalize from one class to the whole grade? And what does a random sample and margin of error tell us? So first of all, samples are the people that you're dealing with. Populations are the people of interest. Like when you do a study in TAMU, the sample is generally the students that come in and do your study. The population is the entire, ideally, the population is the entire community, Laredo, Texas, Hispanic culture, and so on. You want that sample to be similar, right? You want them to be similar in some form of characteristic, age, ethnicity, sex. But oftentimes you cannot do that. Oftentimes in universities, there's more females to males, and things are not really as generalizable as as you want them to be. So oftentimes when we do research, right, can you generalize from one class to the whole grade? That's very difficult, right? Can you actually generalize from that first exam that is going to be the outlook for the entire course? Not necessarily. There's a lot of things to consider. One of them is how random is your sample? If your sample is just nitpicking the top students, then that's a problem. If your sample is random, then that's good. That gets you closer to the actual score, the actual average of what you're looking at. And with any study, there's always going to be some form of margin of error. There's always going to be something that we did not control for that's going to sway the numbers to a certain degree. But the key thing is that when you have plenty of individuals, like a decent sample size, you minimize that margin of error to a certain degree, but it's never eliminated. The margin of error is always going to be there. So these are key things that we should always consider. How close is my sample going to be to my population? That way I can actually say that, yes, my study is impacting Hispanics. And my Hispanic sample, even though they're from TAMU, average age 19.5, whatever, they are a close representation of Laredo culture, for instance. So what we do a lot is random assignment. That's a key factor in experiments, is random assignment. What random assignment does is randomly assign anybody in the sample to a group, either experimental or control group. And the reason why we do random assignment is because we want to have some sort of balance, right? Think about if you were to think about it, if this was an actual on-campus class, and I say, okay, I'm going to split up the class, the first 3 rows. You guys are going to be my experimental condition. The back 3 rows are going to be my control condition. And I'm going to see how well you all do on the exam if I give you candy, let's say, for example. And you find out, hey, I gave the first 3 rows of the class candy. They did well in the exam. That's phenomenal, right? Significance at 0.01. I could publish these results, right? Not really, it's kind of a lame study, but hypothetically, right? The problem there is we didn't randomly assign. And it's very common practice that the top students are going to sit in the front of the class. So your results have already been contaminated. They've already been influenced to something that you did not plan correctly. So if you were to randomly assign people to different groups, regardless of what their standing is and where they sit in the class, then that would be a better study. So these are things that we have to consider. Random assignment is key to any experiment. One thing I did not get a chance to talk about was survey research, which we do a lot of. Survey research is basically filling out questionnaires. You've done it many, many times. You do it for evaluations. You do it for anything that you see on Facebook or social media. How do you like this product? I like it a lot. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Those type of surveys, those type of scales are called Likert scale type of responses, and we use them a lot. We use them a lot to get people's attitudes, people's perceptions on certain things, and they tell us a lot because oftentimes the surveys that we use have a lot of reliability, a lot of validity. Validity basically means that they measure what they're supposed to measure. Like if you fill out a survey for depression and you go to your doctor, it gives you a 10 question piece of paper and it says that you're depressed. Well, those instruments have been validated. They're meant to measure depression, not measure schizophrenia, right? And a lot of these surveys are highly reliable, meaning that if you measure depression at time one, assuming you're still depressed, they're likely to give you the same score at time 3 months from now, assuming you didn't take anything to alleviate your depression. So they're highly reliable, they're consistent. So these are things that to consider anytime you do some sort of research in any sort of psychological field. Okay, so to wrap up, of course, social psychologists social psychologists use a lot of different methods, a lot of different tools to study their variables of interest. And oftentimes we rely on this notion using statistics that the p-value under 0.05 means that the scores or the differences were not coincidental. The definition is a lot more abstract than that. It's a lot more complicated to understand. If you take a stats class, you kind of know the gist. If you take a methodology, you know. But anytime we talk about research and we say p-value was less than 0.05, right? That means that the results were not coincidental. There's something going on to explain those differences. And of course, we value experiments a lot because that allows us to say that X causes Y, and that is dependent on us using random assignments to randomly assign people to different groups to minimize any sort of error and minimize any sort of bias. Right? So that's lecture 2. I combine basically statistics and research methods in a nutshell. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to message me and email me. Thank you.